prototype that I worked on this week was an auto side-scroller where the player has a fragment ability, which when killing an enemy fragments into pieces, which can also kill enemies leading to chain reactions. I started by making the parallax background and the moving camera, and added the player movement, which matches the camera's movement. I also then added enemies spawning randomly at different locations on the side. The original enemy was a shark, but since I wanted the enemies to be able to shoot at the player so the player had something else to dodge, that didn't really work because it made no sense. So I found a new sub sprite, which became the player's sub. The old player sub then became the enemy, and I found a bomb to take the place of the non-shooting enemy. I also added an increase in difficulty, so the more kills the player gets, the higher the difficulty becomes. The enemies spawn more and they move faster based on how many kills the player gets. This helps because beginner players, which can't hit the enemies, don't have that big jumping increase in difficulty until they kill them. I also added an ability bar and the fragment shot, which shows when the player is able to use it. It fills up with each kill and is maxed at 15. This game works with mouse and keyboard, just keyboard or controllers, where the regular shooting is mouse 1, the X key or A, button on the controller, and the fragment ability is right click, the Z key, or the B button on the controller. The main difficulty I had with this was working out how to get the fragmenting to work properly, because the camera's always moving. I needed to be able to make it so it's fragmented correctly and didn't fly off in awkward directions. To polish the game, I added a main menu and the end menu with a high score, so the player can constantly challenge themselves to get a higher score. I also added explosion animations on the enemy and the player deaths, and added background music and sound effects for gunshots, explosions. Since I had a lot of assets spawning, such as enemies, bullets, and the explosion animations, I had to create an extra thing around the outside of the camera that despawned them, so the scene didn't get too cluttered and run poorly. Since I wanted to focus on programming side of it, all of the 2D assets are found from online, so the references to them will be in the blog post. This theme, I wanted to do a multiplayer game, seeing as I had 3 weeks, but my original plan was to do a multiplayer game if it only fit with the theme without forcing it. But since the theme was teamwork, it fit perfectly. For the genre of the game, I decided to do a stealth game where the players distract the guards to help each other get through to the end goal. It allowed me to learn how to make a multiplayer game in Unity and introduce myself to making enemy AI and pathfinding. I began by using Photon Pun Classic by following a tutorial series on YouTube by Diving Squid. It worked really well to begin with, but when I tried to sync the animations across the network it wouldn't work. So I spent some time researching and asking people, and eventually after talking to the people on the Photon Network Discord, I decided on restarting the game entirely by using Photon Pun 2 rather than Classic, as it was a more in-depth and hands-on version. I followed the official tutorial made by Photon, but had a lot of issues in creating rooms and loading levels for players. I eventually had to change it all for another tutorial series by Rugbug Redfern, which eventually made it work. For the character movement, I used the character controller for the first time rather than a rigid body, which I think I prefer, as the character controller .move function is a lot easier to understand. I also made it a third-person camera view for the first time after following the Brackeys tutorial. I used the packaged cinema machine and used a free-look camera. This made it a lot easier as all the programming is done for you. You just tell it what to look at, what to follow, and all the inputs and sensitivities done for you. You can also add an extra thing so it moves the camera out of collisions so it doesn't clip through the walls. I then added a jump and crouch feature for the character and added animations from Mixamo, which I found a really useful website as you can upload the character model you're using, search for the animation you want, and it'll give you all the ones that will work for the rig that you have. Once I had all the animations working and the movement working and syncing across the network, I looked at making the guard AI. I looked at another tutorial series by Sebastian Lage, where you use core routines to move a guard specific point in a path. Once it hits a point, it stops, rotates to its next point, and then continues moving, and then walks around in a loop constantly. I also added a spotlight to the front of the guard to represent its view, and then looked to see if the player was in the area, and if it wasn't being blocked by anything by using a line cast. If the player was in view, it changed the colour of the spotlight from yellow to red. With the base of the guard AI working, I decided on making an actual level rather than the test hub that I was using. I decided to learn how to use Pro Grids and Pro Builder in Unity, which went really well as they work in a similar way to Unreal's BSPs, but you don't need to convert them to static meshes, and you can also still code in C#. Before I began creating the level, I did some research into what makes a good stealth level. The main video that really stood out to me and was really useful was Common Stealth Level Design Mistakes by Ben Bauer, who is one of the level design directors on Splinter Cell. I then made a preliminary sketch to get an idea for the level and then built it in Unity. I decided to go for an outpost kind of thing where the player can infiltrate a guarded perimeter. It also allowed me to add a guard tower that the player can climb so they can get a vantage point for the second half of the area. I also made it the players spawn in an area along the cliff so they also start at a vantage point. With the level built, I decided to make a rock throwing feature which could distract the guards. I made it so it was instantiated by the player and then gets launched with a rigid body.addForce function. I made it so it would go in the direction the camera was facing, and if I had enough time I would have made it so the player could see the trajectory before throwing, allowing them to increase or decrease the force so they can specifically put it in places. Once I had the rock throw done, I needed to make so the guard would go towards where it landed. I did this by making so the rock had a sound radius, so all guards within that radius would be alerted when it landed. To make the guard walk towards the rock, originally I had the idea of giving it various transforms in a radius around the rock as chill run, so it would check which was closest and move the guard towards it in a straight line, so all the guards wouldn't be trying to stand on the same spot. However, it occurred to me it wouldn't necessarily work as there could be things in the way, so I had to learn how to do pathfinding, which turned out really simple as I had looked at the Brackeys nav mesh tutorial, which is the pathfinding tool built into Unity. All you need to do is designate what is a walkable floor and give the moving character a nav mesh agent component. With that, all you need to do is tell it a location and it will calculate the path and walk towards it. I also didn't need to use trial transforms as I can specify a stopping distance, which is how far away from the location it can go before it stops moving, which fit the purpose of preventing all the guards from going to the same spot. Once I had that working, I needed to make the guards search for the player. Since the stealth game AI are usually made with finite state machines, I tried to emulate a basic one. So the guard had a patrolling state and a searching state. When patrolling, they will go along the predefined path, and when searching, they will go towards the source of the noise, rotate 180 degrees clockwise, anti-clockwise, wait a couple seconds, and then do a 360-degree spin before walking back to the current waypoint. Once they are at the waypoint, they will go back to the patrolling state. With the guard able to be distracted, I finished the tutorial series by Sebastian Legge and made it so the player doesn't get caught immediately, but if they stay in the guard's view for too long, then they get caught. This is shown by the colour of the guard's light turning red over time rather than instantly. Once caught, the player can't move and his caught UI is shown where they can either restart the level or leave. If the players make it to the end, then the win UI shows up, congratulating them, allowing them to go back to the menu. However, it only shows if all players reach the end, so no man is left behind. The biggest issue I had was getting everything to work over a network. To begin with, the movement and animations were synced eventually, but once I finished the prototype, I could only get it to work from a single player perspective. While multiple players can play in the same level, there is a lot of problems such as the syncing no longer being smooth but really laggy. The guard's patrol was synced up, but when a guard gets distracted, it's only on the player who threw the rock's point of view. It doesn't sync up. This is a problem as it means the players can't directly help each other by distracting other guards. However, they could still go to vantage points and describe where the guards are to other players. So there is still some teamwork aspect to it. It only got worse as the end UI, which is the win and losing screen, would only show up for the player who got caught or actually reaches the end, which means if one player got caught, they wouldn't be able to move, whereas the other player would and could still do the level. This does kind of work, but wasn't the intended plan. So I realized when editing that when I built the game and sent it to my friend for recording the multiplayer, the lag issues fixed itself, which means it might have actually been possible to finish the prototype, but I would have still had to research how to access a player's script on the other network rather than on the local network. If I had more time, I could have worked out all of the bugs and issues, but since I spent around 2.5 weeks working solely on this project, I had to stop and work on my other assignments because I hadn't done anything for them yet. From this prototype, I learned a lot of new things about Unity, such as networking, AI, pathfinding, using character controllers, and how to build levels with ProGrids and ProBuilder. One thing I realised was how difficult networking multiplayers actually are, but they aren't impossible. It just takes a lot more time and research to be able to understand how to get things to sync and work well together over a network. I would enjoy continuing to research and learning how to make them in the future, but primarily I think I want to focus on single player games for now and getting a better understanding of things like the pathfinding and AI before making it work across the network. I did really enjoy the AI side of things and would like to really expand on that and the pathfinding and maybe use it in a future prototype, such as a click to move game, like how movement is done in RuneScape, where you click with a mouse and then the player calculates a path and walks for you. I created all of the materials myself for this project, but I did use the base ProGrid material to get the grid lines and then just altered the colour. I also used a basic dummy and bodyguards that I found on the Unity Asset Store, and all my animations was found through Mixamo, all of which will be referenced in the blog post other than specific animations as they don't have a creator but can be found through Mixamo.
For the 10 seconds or less theme, I decided to make a semi-real-time strategy game in a similar style to the XCOM games, where the player has 10 seconds to make the move before the enemy moves. I started with getting the pathfinding working, which was simple due to the previous themes. I also used a tutorial to create an isometric camera view. Next, I worked on adding a line renderer, which to the player shows the path they would take when they click. I had a little trouble getting it to the limit range, but I eventually got it working by recalculating the path if it went further than the max range. Next, I added obstacles, which gave the player a cover value when they were within the trigger. I added enemies, which moved in a similar way to the player, but chose a random cover to stay behind. I had some issues with it, as in XCOM games is grid-based, whereas this is just a world-based, so I had to add child objects to the covers, which the enemy movement script uses as a reference on where to go. I made it choose one at random, as I don't have enough time to make an algorithm which calculates the most advantageous spot to go to. I also made it so that once the enemy moves close enough for the player to be within shooting range, they didn't move but shortened the play instead. I added a timer which swaps the turn once it runs out. I also added an end turn button if the player makes all their moves but still have time left, and the enemies automatically end their turn once they make the move. I added a rifle model to the player and enemies by making a child of the model's hand, and got animations from Mixamo for the movement, shooting, idle, and getting shot actions. For the shooting action, it rotates the model towards the target so they're aiming correctly, and then plays a shoot animation. It checks if it hits by using a random number generator to see if the target's cover is greater than the cover value they have. If it is, then the shot hits. For the player shooting, I made it so you can cycle through the targets, because there's multiple enemies, and then click a button to shoot. To prevent things from cluttering the screen, I added a mode change button, which swapped the player from being able to shoot and being able to move. Finally, I added health to the player and enemies and prevented the player from moving and shooting infinitely by limiting it to 2 movements and 1 shot per turn. I used a tutorial to get the enemy health bars to rotate to the camera so they're always straight on and visible. To expand the prototype, I would make an enemy algorithm which calculates the best movements and shots it can take. I would also like to make it so the player can control more than one character, like how in XCOM they have whole squads of people they control.